Welcome to Psychology 1340, Introduction to Psychology. I'm Professor Greg Schneller, and I'm glad you're part of this course. In this course, we will be looking at a lot of different topics in the broad field of psychology. We won't be able to go into any one topic in great depth because of the many topics we'll be covering, but I think that you'll find it's a fascinating introduction to what psychologists do and what they study. If you like particular topics within this course, you may think about taking another psychology course that would be a follow-up. For example, if you like learning about children, you might want to take the developmental psychology course as a follow-up to this course. If you like learning about how people interact, you may be interested in taking the social psychology course as a follow-up to this course. Within this course, we're going to start small, looking at what psychology is and the way that we do research methods. Then we'll start on the micro level, looking at the nerve cells and how they contribute to our psychology. We'll move upwards to basic processes like sensation and perception. We'll move to even more complex levels, such as how do we learn and remember. Then we'll look at personality, that is, how does all of what we study in psychology come together in the individual person. And finally, we will look at some interactions between people and how social psychology can teach us about interactions between people. And then we'll wrap up the semester studying psychological disorders and how they're treated. So welcome to Introduction to Psychology. A brief note, as you move through these slides, you'll find that in most slides I will say end of slide or next slide at the end. On most slides you'll need to click to go on to the next slide once you're done with it. Next slide. So what is psychology and how is it studied? That's the topic for this lecture. When I ask this question to students, what is psychology, I get answers such as, it's therapy, or it has to do with emotions, or it has to do with why people treat each other the way they treat each other. These are all good answers. But let's go back to the root word of psychology. We'll start that on the next slide. Here's a question for your consideration. The root meaning of the word psychology, that is, psyche, literally means the study of soul, or spirit, or life. Do you think that psychology is the only field that can adequately examine the soul, spirit, or life? Why or why not? When I ask this question to students, typically the answer I get is no. Psychology is not the only field that can adequately examine the soul, spirit, or life. Students begin to list off other fields that also study the same sort of thing. Oftentimes they'll say anthropology or sociology, because those have to do with humanity and human interactions. Other people will say music or literature, because they tell us about the human soul. And then other people will say, well, no, obviously theology or the study of religion tells us about the spirit or the soul or the life. So what makes psychology different from all these other fields? Why do we have a distinct field of psychology when all of these other fields also study the soul and spirit and life? Click on the next slide to find out. Next slide. So let's look at how psychology defines itself as a field. Psychology is defined as the study of behaviors and mental processes. Behavior is easy enough to define. Behavior is our observable actions. And psychologists are interested in why people act the way that they act. But what about this other term, mental processes? Mental processes are the things that happen internally. They're not observable to people outside of us, but they're things that we experience within us. So mental processes might include feelings. They might include beliefs about the world or beliefs about ourselves. Mental processes include our thoughts, how we go about reasoning and understanding the world. Mental processes also include things like our sensations and our perceptions. All of these things are internal and not observable, but they're all within the realm of the study of psychology. Next. Now, psychology has its roots, historically, in the realm of philosophy. For thousands of years, men have pondered questions like, what is wisdom? What is moral behavior? In fact, as we look at the ancient Hebrews, we see them asking these questions, for example, in the book of Proverbs, in the book of Ecclesiastes, in the Old Testament of the Bible. We see people pondering, what is moral behavior? We look at the Old Testament. We see 10 commandments, as well as many other commandments that tell us about what moral behavior is. In the New Testament, we see Jesus debating with the Pharisees and Sadducees about what moral behavior is. So obviously these are questions that have been around forever, and questions that are still occupying psychologists. Questions the Greek philosophers came up with were things like, are the mind and the body separate, or are they of one single substance? Is knowledge inborn, or is it learned by experience? Where is the mind located in the body? All of these are questions that philosophers have asked and that psychologists have still addressed. We can also see in European philosophers like Descartes, Bacon, and Locke in the 1600s questions such as, how do the brain and nerves move the body? Where does superstition come from? Is learning pre-wired into our brain, or is our mind a blank slate at birth? All of these questions are questions that have evolved into questions addressed by the field of psychology. Next slide. Okay, here's a quick quiz over what we've covered so far. Psychology is defined as the scientific study of which two? Behavior, relationships, therapy, or mental processes? The answer is number 1 and number 4, behavior and mental processes. Of course we're interested in relationships and therapy, but those are things that fall under the categories of behaviors and mental processes. Now if you look at this question, you'll see that I've slipped a word in here. Originally I said psychology is the study of behavior and mental processes, but now I've slipped a word in there, haven't I? Psychology is defined as the scientific study of behavior and mental processes. The scientific study is what differentiates psychology from these other fields we've talked about, like philosophy or religion, theology, literature. So let's go on to talk some about scientific approach to psychology. Next slide. Modern psychology became a science when philosophy was blended with fields such as biology and medicine. The blending of these natural sciences with philosophy of mind gave birth to modern psychology. What we find is in the later 1800s in Germany, the real start of psychology begins with studying psychological principles in the laboratory. What is it that makes psychology a science, though? Two things: a scientific attitude and a scientific method. Let's look at scientific attitude to begin with. A scientific attitude is one in which we're both skeptical of facts or findings, but also open-minded about those facts and findings. So the scientific attitude tries to balance both of these. For example, in 1990, a psychologist by the name of Francine Shapiro wrote an article claiming that she had developed a new type of psychotherapy called eye movement deprocessing and reprogramming, EMDR for short. And Shapiro said that EMDR is a powerful tool for helping people who have traumatic memories, helping them to get over those memories. Shapiro said that the method by which she did this EMDR technique was to have her patients talk about the traumas that they'd been through. So for example, if she was working with a client who had been sexually assaulted, she would have the client talk about the story of events leading up to and during and after the sexual assault. Periodically throughout the story, as the patient told the story, Shapiro would stop and interrupt and have the patient look at Shapiro's fingers. Shapiro would take 2 fingers and move them rapidly back and forth in front of the patient's eyes. And the patient would try and focus on those fingers as they moved rapidly back and forth. In other words, what was happening is Shapiro was causing the patient to move her eyes back and forth, back and forth, back and forth in a very rapid fashion. So Shapiro would periodically interrupt the traumatic story and use these eye movements, and then this patient would go on with the story, then would be interrupted with eye movements and go on with the story, and so forth. What Shapiro claimed was that this helped to reduce the traumatic impact of the trauma that had happened. So, for example, nightmares or recurrent thoughts about the trauma would be lessened as a result of doing EMDR. The scientific community and psychological community responded to Shapiro by saying, "Huh, sure, right, prove it." In other words, what we said was, okay, we're open-minded enough that we want you to prove it, but we're also skeptical. You have to show us some evidence in order for us to believe that this is true. That is psychology at its best, both being open-minded to new findings, but also being skeptical and demanding scientific proof. One of my favorite quotes is the quote, "I believe in being open-minded, but not so open that my brains fall out." It emphasizes the need for proof, but also the need for humility. Now here's a little exercise that you can try, that I try in classroom with my students. If you fill a glass, and it works best if the glass is made of glass, if you fill it full of water to where it's completely full, do you think you could drop a penny in it? If you dropped a penny into a completely full glass of water, what would happen? Do you think the water would spill out? You might try this. But if you drop the penny in it, what you'll find is, unless you splash the penny on the surface of the water, the penny will go into the water and the water will not come out of the glass. Do you think you could do that with 2 pennies? You could, putting them in one at a time. Do you think you could do it with 3 pennies? Well, you might be skeptical about it, but open-minded enough to test it. Do you think you could do it with 20 to 30 pennies? Guess what? You probably can. Are you skeptical that you could drop 20 to 30 pennies into a full glass of water? Well, why don't you be open-minded enough to test it out and see if you can? That's a scientific attitude. The scientific method involves measurement and control. Next slide. All right, we're going to come back to the scientific method in just a little while. But first, let's talk some more about why it is that we need to use a scientific approach to psychology in the first place. Here's a question for you. Is psychology simply common sense dressed up in fancy jargon or fancy words? Why or why not? Some people will look at this and say, well, no, because psychology really involves laboratory studies. But other people will say, you know, I'm skeptical. I think that a lot of psychology is just using fancy words for what we already know. Well, let's take a look at some research findings here, and this will help us to know whether or not we need to think of psychology as science or whether it's common sense. Okay, here's a research finding for you. The first research finding: recent psychological research has found that people who are low in self-esteem are more susceptible to flattery. In other words, people who are low in self-esteem are going to be more influenced by flattery from other people. Does this finding surprise you? Take a moment to think about it and answer yes or no before you go on to the next slide. Next slide. Research finding number 2. Recent psychological research has found that people who are high in self-esteem are more susceptible to flattery. Does this finding surprise you? Yes or no? Okay, what's going on here? How is this research finding different than the previous one? The only difference is the word high in self-esteem versus low in self-esteem. Research finding number 1 said low in self-esteem. Research finding number 2 said high in self-esteem. Now, for research finding number 1, what was your answer to the question? Did the finding surprise you? I'll bet you most of you said no. You weren't surprised by it. Why? Because it seems like common sense that people who are low in self-esteem are more susceptible to flattery. But if you had received research finding number 2 first, what would you have said? chances are you would have said no. Now, the reason I know this is because I do this with my face-to-face psychology classes every semester. Half the students get research finding number 1, half of them get research finding number 2, and I ask them to read them and ask whether or not they're surprised. Guess what? Pretty much everybody in the class says, no, I'm not surprised by the finding, regardless of whether it's high, they find that the study says high in self-esteem or low in self-esteem. The problem here is that when we are aware of some information, in hindsight we can look back at that information and say, oh, well, I knew that that would happen. We have what is called a hindsight bias. Move on to the next slide and we'll talk some more about hindsight bias and why it is a reason that we have to use the scientific method in psychology. Next slide. The hindsight bias means that in hindsight we feel certain that we knew what was going to happen. That's illustrated by the research studies that we just talked about, which, by the way, aren't even real research studies, but they could be. And if you looked at those and said, I know, that doesn't surprise me, the chances are you are affected by the hindsight bias. Hindsight bias we see in everyday life. For example, the two images are tragic images up in the top left and right hand corners of this slide. The top right hand corner shows the disintegration of the Space Shuttle Columbia as it re-entered the atmosphere a number of years ago. The Space Shuttle Columbia was cleared to take off and cleared to land by those who knew that it was damaged, but they said, it'll be okay, we know that it's going to work out. And everybody trusted the space engineers' judgment until the Space Shuttle Columbia came apart upon re-entry. Then all the government agencies began to say, well, any bozo would have known that that would have come apart, that it would have blown up. The hindsight bias kicked in. Well, anyone would have known that that shuttle should not have been able to function as it was. The same thing with the tragic image on the top left. What happened is after 9/11 we started hearing intense criticism of government agencies like the CIA and the FBI and the administration saying, well, we should have known that this was going to happen. We should have known that there were going to be these terrorist attacks. Anybody who had any sense could have looked at the information ahead of time and known it was going to happen. Once again, we have the hindsight bias in effect. Afterwards, we feel certain that we would have known what was going to happen. So the hindsight bias prevents us from accurately understanding situations, including people's behavior and mental processes. Therefore, we need the scientific method within psychology. Next. Okay, here's a question for consideration. On a TV talk show, you see a guy who claims to have psychic powers. He says he can move objects just by thinking about them. What evidence, under what conditions, would convince you that he really has these psychic powers? Before you go on to the next slide, write down for yourself what evidence, under what conditions, would convince you. Next slide. Okay, what does a scientific method involve? Well, let's think about your responses to the previous slide. Many people in response to that question would say, well, I'd have to directly watch this guy do his mental manipulation of objects. I don't really think that he can do this. I'm skeptical, but I'm open-minded enough to test it out, and therefore I'd have to watch him do it, but I'd have to watch him directly, in person. I wouldn't observe him over television and assume that it was okay and that everything was right, because someone might use special effects to manipulate. So part of what the scientific method involves is the idea of direct observation of events. Think back to EMDR. Francine Shapiro reported that EMDR helped to cure her clients of trauma symptoms. But the scientific community said, we have to have direct observation of these events. We're not just going to take your word for it. We need to have direct observation of events. Now, other people might have said in response to the question about the psychic, I would want to see him in a neutral room where he could not have somehow manipulated the table or manipulated wherever the object was setting, he couldn't manipulate it in advance. So it would have to be a neutral room or a new room or maybe my own room. He could not have other extra clothing on, no fringes hanging off of his coat or whatever. He couldn't have any kind of other possessions. He would have to be very tight control of the situation to study this psychic to see if he really can do what he says he can do. In the same way, the scientific method involves experimental control of a situation. For example, if we were looking at EMDR, we would insist that the same treatment method be used each time and that we have trained therapists who are using this method so that we don't have a different method, EMDR method, happening each time the therapist tries to use EMDR. In addition, you might have said in response to the question about the psychic that, hey, I'm going to choose what objects he moves. So if he can move, if I bring my own purse and he can move my purse, or I bring my own wallet and he can move my wallet, then I might be more likely to believe it. But if he pulls his wallet out and puts it on the table and then he proceeds to move it, well, I don't think I would want to use his objects. It'd have to be something that I have chosen. Maybe I could choose objects that he didn't know about, that he didn't know that he was going to have to move. Or maybe I could have him even move me, or some sort of random objects. This would be a clear case of manipulating the variables, making sure that you're using a variety of variables so that you know that if he can actually move them all, then certainly you've got some evidence for him being able to do this psychic phenomenon. Looking at EMDR, a way that we might manipulate the variables in a study of EMDR is to have various types of PTSD trauma treated by EMDR. So, for example, one person who had undergone a sexual assault. Let's have treatment of someone who had been through a war. Let's have treatment of someone who'd been through a traumatic car accident and injury. Let's have treatment of someone who had watched another person be shot. Let's use EMDR with all of these traumatic situations and see if the patients who experienced all of these different traumas, if EMDR works for all of those. That would be an example of manipulating the variables in a scientific fashion. Finally, replication is important. So if you said, only under these conditions would I believe about the psychic, the previous conditions would I believe about the psychic, and I said to you, okay, would you have to see him only move something once under those conditions? Chances are you'd say, no, I'd want him to see him move things multiple times. You'd want him to repeat it while you're watching. That would be an example of replication. Scientific method also involves replication of events. We want to see more than one instance that proves to us that a scientific fact is in fact valid. One of the ways that we do this is by using large groups of people. And so we want to see whether or not a technique such as EMDR works with a large group of people. So would it work if it works with one person, we might be skeptical. If it works with 3 or 4 different people, we might be a little more inclined to believe it. But if we had 30 different patients or 50 different patients who were treated using EMDR on various occasions, then with that sort of replication, we might believe that EMDR is indeed a valid treatment. So direct observation, experimental control, manipulation, and replication are all hallmarks of the scientific method. Now, what is your explanation or theory about what's really going on with this guy who claims to be a psychic? I'll tell you mine. My theory is that this guy is really just a crook, that he is out trying to make money, and he's trying to manipulate people and get rich and get a reputation. That would be my theory if I saw a guy on TV who claimed to be a psychic. I would be skeptical for sure. Next slide. So this brings us to the last 2 characteristics of the scientific method. Those characteristics are the ideas of theories and hypotheses. I said my theory about the man was that he was a sham, that he was a con artist, that he was trying to make money or get a reputation. A theory is an idea or a statement which will explain behavior and mental processes. So my theory that he's a con man is an idea that explains why he's acting and saying the things that he's saying. We can also have theories explaining psychological processes. For example, we could develop a theory about EMDR and why EMDR works. A theory for EMDR might be that the eye movement part just distracts a person from thinking about a trauma, and that they're telling the trauma and becoming upset inside as they talk about the trauma, as they tell the story, and then we distract them. And as we distract them, we lessen their emotional distress. So that's a theory, that's an idea that might explain why EMDR works. But how could we test a theory? Hypotheses are testable predictions that we generate about behavior. We predict what we think will happen, and then we test it. So my theory about the con man, about the psychic, is that he's a con man. A hypothesis or testable prediction would be to say, under certain circumstances, that is, in my house, at my table, I predict that he will not be able to move my wallet. What I've developed is a testable prediction. The theory is a broad statement. The hypothesis is a much more specific, testable prediction. How about EMDR? If our theory of EMDR is that the eye movements just distract a person and help to lessen their anxiety or distress, how could we test this theory? Could we perhaps use some other means of distraction? How about if we set up a hypothesis that says we're going to do a version of EMDR in which instead of having them move their eyes, we're going to have them tap their foot. So we'll do the same thing with EMDR, except when the person becomes distressed while telling about the trauma, we'll stop them and have them tap their foot instead of move their eyes back and forth. We could test this prediction. We could test whether or not this would actually work as well as EMDR. We could see if there's the same amount of distress reduction as a result of using this testable hypothesis. So scientific method involves broad theories and specific hypotheses. Let's go on and see if you've got this idea down on the next slide. Here we are. Here's a quick quiz over theories and hypotheses. Which of the ones below is a theory and which is a testable hypothesis? Number 1. 80% of adolescents make their career choice between ages 18 and 19. Is that a theory or a hypothesis? The question here, is it testable? Yes, we can definitely test this. What we've done is predict that a certain percentage of adolescents will make a career choice at a certain time. We can predict and test and measure that. How about the second one? During adolescence, developing a career direction is an important psychological task. That's really more of an idea, isn't it? It's not exactly something we can directly test. We would have to form a hypothesis out of it, but because it's more of an idea that describes behavior, this would be a theory. Okay, we've come to the end of the first lecture in Intro Psychology. If you go on to the next slide, you'll see a tip for studying. Next slide. Here's an academic study tip. As you take notes, as you go through these lectures, I would encourage you to review your notes as soon as possible after you've looked at them. Now, we don't have specific class times because it's an online course, but I would encourage you to review your notes again as soon as possible after you took them. It's only going to take you maybe 5 minutes to review your notes, and if you review your notes after each class period or after each time that you take the notes, this will help you to remember them. This is true for classes that you're taking face-to-face as well. As soon as possible after class, always review your notes, taking maybe 5 minutes. End of lecture.